A kingdom forgiven. Lady Catherine of Dunmere had once believed Sir Tristan de Clare to be the most loyal of knights until she saw him standing beside her father's murderer. Now, as he trapped her against the stone wall, his voice was quiet but raw. "You think I betrayed you," he murmured. "But tell me, my lady, what if I was the one betrayed?" Chapter 1. The Shadow of Dunmere. The wind howled a mournful dirge around the battlements of Dunmere Castle, mimicking the tempest that raged within Lady Catherine's breast. It had been 5 years since that fateful day, 5 years since the crimson stain of her father's blood had seeped into the stones of the courtyard, 5 years since she had last seen the glint of betrayal in Sir Tristan de Clare's steel-grey eyes. Yet, the memory remained as vivid as a freshly painted fresco, the colors stark and unforgiving. The chill of the stones seeped through the thick wool of her gown as she leaned against the parapet, her gaze lost in the swirling mists that clung to the valley below. Dunmere, once a beacon of strength and prosperity, now felt like a gilded cage, its beauty a cruel mockery of the freedom she had lost. Her father, Baron Alaric, had been a man of unwavering justice, a ruler who valued loyalty above all else. His death, at the hands of Lord Alaric of Blackwood, had shattered not only Catherine's world, but the delicate balance of power in the region. And Sir Tristan de Clare, the knight she had once admired, the man whose quiet strength had been a comforting presence in her childhood, had stood beside Alaric, his sword unbloodied, but his eyes reflecting a cold, unreadable light. That image was seared into her memory, a constant reminder of the knife of treachery that had twisted in her heart. She closed her eyes, the wind whipping strands of her auburn hair across her face. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled her nostrils, a familiar comfort that did little to soothe the ache in her soul. She could almost hear her father's booming laughter echoing through the halls, the clatter of knights training in the yard, the gentle hum of her mother's spinning wheel. But those sounds were ghosts now, replaced by the hushed whispers of servants and the ever-present tension that hung heavy in the air. Her hand instinctively went to the small, silver locket she wore hidden beneath her gown. It contained a miniature portrait of her father, his stern but kind face a constant reminder of the legacy she was now burdened with. After his death, the responsibility of Dunmere had fallen upon her shoulders. A young woman, barely past her 20th year, thrust into a world of political maneuvering and veiled threats. The sound of footsteps on the stone stairs startled her. She turned, her hand instinctively moving to the small dagger she kept concealed in her sleeve. It was only Alara, her lady-in-waiting and closest confidant, her face etched with concern. "My lady," Alara said, her voice soft, "you should not be out here in this cold. You will catch your death." Catherine managed a weak smile. "The cold cannot touch me, Alara. It has already taken root within my heart." Alara's brow furrowed. She had been with Catherine since they were children, sharing secrets and dreams in the sun-drenched gardens of Dunmere. She knew the depth of Catherine's grief, the silent burden she carried. "The council awaits you, my lady," Alara said gently. "They are eager to discuss the matter of Lord Alric's latest missive." Catherine sighed. Alric. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Since her father's death, he had been relentless in his attempts to claim Dunmere, either through force or marriage. His latest letter, delivered by a grim-faced messenger that morning, had been an ultimatum, veiled in the flowery language of courtly diplomacy. Marry him and secure peace for Dunmere. Refuse and face the consequences. "Let them wait," Catherine said, her voice hardening. "I will not be rushed into a decision that could seal the fate of my people." Alara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "As you wish, my lady. But know this, you are not alone. The people of Dunmere are loyal to you, to the memory of your father." Catherine looked out at the valley again, the mist beginning to dissipate, revealing glimpses of the rolling hills and fertile fields that made up her domain. She had a duty to protect them, to ensure their survival. But at what cost? Could she truly sacrifice her own happiness, her own freedom, to appease a man she despised? The council chamber was a cold, imposing room, dominated by a large, oak table surrounded by high-backed chairs. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the unspoken tension of the assembled lords and advisors. Catherine entered with her head held high, her expression carefully neutral. She took her seat at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the men gathered there. Lord Baldwin, her father's oldest advisor, a man whose loyalty was beyond question, cleared his throat. "My lady," he began, his voice raspy with age, "we have read Lord Elric's proposal. It is, to say the least, a difficult situation." Sir Reginald, the captain of the guard, a seasoned warrior with a scarred face and a blunt demeanor, spoke next. "Difficult? It's an insult. He murders her father, then demands her hand in marriage? We should ride out and meet him on the battlefield." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Catherine held up a hand, silencing them. "We must consider all options," she said, her voice calm but firm. "War would be costly both in lives and resources. Dunmere is strong, but Blackwood is a formidable enemy." The debate raged for hours, the council divided between those who favored defiance and those who urged caution. Catherine listened patiently, weighing their arguments, her mind racing. She knew that Elric was not a man to be trifled with. He was ruthless, ambitious, and he had the backing of several other powerful lords. As the meeting drew to a close, a messenger arrived, breathless and pale. He approached Catherine, bowing low. "My lady," he stammered, "a rider approaches under a flag of truce. He claims to be Sir Tristan de Clare." The room fell silent. Catherine felt a jolt of something akin to fear, mixed with a strange, unsettling anticipation. Tristan. Here. After all these years. What could he possibly want? She rose from her chair, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Let him enter," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within. She had to face him. She had to know why he had come. The air in the great hall seemed to crackle with a sudden, electric tension as the heavy oak doors swung inward. He stood silhouetted against the fading light of the late afternoon, his figure tall and imposing, clad in travel-worn leather and a dark, unadorned surcoat. The years had etched lines of hardship onto his face, a web of fine creases around his eyes, a deeper furrow between his brows. But his eyes, those steel-gray eyes that she remembered so vividly, still held the same unsettling intensity, though now they seemed shadowed by a weariness she hadn't seen before. It was a flicker, and yet it stayed. He moved with a warrior's grace, his hand resting lightly on the pommel of the sword at his hip. It was not a gesture of aggression, but rather a habit, ingrained by years of training and battle. He stopped a respectful distance from Catherine, his gaze meeting hers without flinching. She was cornered, trapped, for a reason she would soon find out. It was clear. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice low and resonant, the sound sending a shiver down her spine, a sensation she had not felt in years, one she both resented and craved. "I have come to speak with you." Chapter 2. A Knight's Accusation. The silence in the great hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was fixed on Tristan, a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and outright hostility swirling in the air. Catherine remained standing, her back straight, her expression unreadable. The years had hardened her, had taught her to mask her emotions behind a facade of icy composure. But beneath that surface, a maelstrom of conflicting feelings raged. "You have come to speak," she repeated, her voice cool and measured. "After 5 years. After standing beside the man who murdered my father." Tristan's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering in his cheek. He held her gaze, unflinching. "I understand your anger, my lady, your suspicion. But I ask you to hear me out. There are things you do not know." Catherine's hand tightened on the armrest of her chair. "And what things are those, Sir Tristan? What could possibly excuse your presence at my father's death, at the side of his killer?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet still carrying across the silent hall. "I did not betray your father, Lady Catherine. I swear it on my honor, on the memory of my own father, who served yours faithfully for many years." A murmur rippled through the assembled lords and advisors. Honor. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. In their world, a knight's honor was his most prized possession, more valuable than gold or land. To break an oath, to betray a trust, was the gravest of sins. Your honor? Catherine scoffed, a bitter edge to her voice. You speak of honor, yet you stood by and watched as Elric's blade struck him down. Tristan's eyes flashed with a flicker of pain, quickly suppressed. I was not there by choice, my lady. I was a prisoner, in a manner of speaking, bound by an oath I could not break. An oath? Catherine's voice rose slightly. What oath could possibly supersede your loyalty to your liege lord, to my father? He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers for the first time. He looked at the assembled council, then back at Catherine, his expression troubled. It is a long story, my lady. One that is not easily told in the presence of so many witnesses. Catherine considered his words. She sensed a genuine conflict within him, a struggle between his desire to speak and his fear of the consequences. She glanced at Lord Baldwin, her trusted advisor, who gave a slight nod, his eyes conveying a silent message. Listen to him. There may be more to this than we know. Very well, Sir Tristan, she said, her voice regaining its composure. You shall have your audience. But not here. We will speak in private, in my father's solar. She rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and graceful. Lord Baldwin, Sir Reginald, please ensure that Sir Tristan is accommodated. But keep him under guard. I will not risk any further treachery within these walls. The solar was a smaller, more intimate room than the Great Hall. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn tapestry that adorned the walls. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, chasing away the chill of the stone walls. It was a room filled with memories, with the echoes of her father's presence. Catherine sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tristan stood before her, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. The two guards she had assigned remained at the door, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Now, Sir Tristan, she said, her voice low and steady, tell me your story. Tell me why you believe you were betrayed, and by whom. He took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers. It began long before your father's death, my lady. It began with my own father, Sir Gareth de Clare. He was a loyal knight, a man of unwavering honor. But he made a mistake, a grave error in judgment that would cost him his life, and nearly cost me mine. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Catherine leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. She had always known Tristan's father, Sir Gareth, as a respected and honorable man. What could he have possibly done? He discovered a plot, Tristan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. A conspiracy to overthrow your father, to place Lord Elric on the throne of Dunmere. He learned of it too late, when he was already implicated. He was accused of treason, of being a part of the plot. Catherine gasped. Treason? But that's impossible. Sir Gareth was one of my father's most trusted men. I know, Tristan said, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. But there was evidence. Fabricated evidence, I believe now. Letters, signed with his seal, outlining his supposed involvement in the conspiracy. He was arrested, tried, and condemned to death. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered the day Sir Gareth had been executed, the somber atmosphere that had hung over Dunmere. She had been young then, but she had understood that something terrible had happened. My father, he believed the evidence? She asked, her voice trembling. Tristan nodded. He did. He had no reason to doubt it. The evidence was convincing. And Elric, he was there, whispering in your father's ear, poisoning his mind against my father. He paused, his fists clenched at his sides. I was only a squire then, barely 17 years old. I begged your father to spare my father's life, to investigate further. But he refused. He said he had to uphold the law, to show no mercy to traitors. Catherine closed her eyes, picturing the scene, a young Tristan, desperate and heartbroken, pleading for his father's life. She could almost feel his pain, his anguish. "My father was executed," Tristan continued, his voice raw with emotion. "And I was spared, but only on one condition. Elric made a deal with your father. He said he would spare my life if I swore an oath of fealty to him, if I pledged to serve him without question." Catherine's eyes snapped open. "You swore an oath to Elric?" Tristan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I did. I had no choice. It was the only way to survive, to bide my time, to find a way to clear my father's name and avenge his death." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "That is why I was there, my lady, at your father's side when Elric killed him. I was bound by my oath. I could not raise a hand against him, not without breaking my vow and forfeiting my own life." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I did not stand idly by, my lady. I did what I could. I delayed Elric's attack, giving your father a few precious seconds to defend himself. It was not enough, I know, but it was all I could do." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, leather-bound pouch. He held it out to her. "This," he said, "contains proof. Proof of my father's innocence, proof of Elric's treachery. It is the reason I have come back to Dunmere after all these years. To clear my father's name, and to help you bring Elric to justice." Catherine stared at the pouch, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Could Tristan have been telling the truth all along? Was it possible that she had misjudged him, that she had condemned an innocent man in her heart? The weight of doubt, of years of built-up resentment, pressed heavily upon her. But there, shimmering beneath it all, was a sliver of hope. A fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally in the most unexpected of places. She looked at him and locked her eyes on his. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Stone. Catherine reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the pouch from Tristan's hand. The leather was worn and soft, bearing the faint imprint of a crest, the rampant lion of House de Clare, a symbol she had once associated with loyalty and honor, now tainted by the shadow of betrayal. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze meeting Tristan's. The intensity in his eyes was unnerving, a mixture of pleading and defiance that both challenged and intrigued her. She opened the pouch, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, nestled amongst a few dried herbs and a small, tarnished silver coin, were several rolled-up pieces of parchment, tied together with a thin leather cord. She carefully untied the cord and spread the parchments on the small table beside her, her heart pounding in her chest. The first document was a letter, written in a bold, confident hand. It was addressed to Sir Gareth de Clare, Tristan's father, and signed with the unmistakable seal of Lord Elric of Blackwood. The contents were chilling. Elric outlined a detailed plan to assassinate Baron Alaric and seize control of Dunmere. He promised Gareth riches and power in exchange for his support, urging him to use his position of trust to weaken the castle's defenses and sow discord among the guards. Catherine felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The words swam before her eyes, each sentence a testament to Elric's ruthlessness and ambition. She had always known he was a dangerous man, but to see his treachery laid bare in black and white was a different matter entirely. The second parchment was a copy of a letter, supposedly written by Sir Gareth to Lord Elric. It was a reply to Elric's offer, accepting his terms and pledging his loyalty to the conspiracy. The handwriting was similar to Gareth's, but Catherine noticed subtle differences, a slight tremor in the strokes, a lack of the usual flourish in his signature. The third document was the most damning. It was a confession, written in Tristan's own hand, shortly after his father's execution. He detailed his forced oath to Elric, his desperate attempts to find evidence of his father's innocence, and his growing suspicion that the letters implicating his father were forgeries. He described how he had secretly investigated Elric's movements, eavesdropping on conversations, searching for any clue that could unravel the conspiracy. Catherine read the confession with growing astonishment. Tristan's words were filled with anguish and determination, a desperate plea for justice that resonated deep within her soul. He had risked everything, his life, his honor, to uncover the truth. The final piece of parchment was a small, folded note, written in a delicate, feminine hand. Catherine recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her mother's. The note was addressed to Sir Gareth, and it was dated just a few days before her father's death. "My dearest Gareth," the note began, "I have heard whispers, rumors of a plot against my husband. I fear for his safety and for the future of Dunmere. I implore you, if you know anything, if you have any evidence, please come forward. Do not let fear silence you. The fate of our people rests on your shoulders." Catherine's hand trembled as she read the note. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, had sensed the danger, had reached out to Gareth for help. But her plea had gone unanswered, lost in the web of deceit and betrayal that had enveloped Dunmere. She looked up at Tristan, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and a dawning respect. This changes everything," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Tristan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know it does, my lady. It is a heavy burden to bear, the knowledge that your father was betrayed, not by my father, but by the man he trusted." Catherine closed her eyes, trying to absorb the enormity of the revelation. Her entire world had been turned upside down. The man she had condemned as a traitor was, in fact, a victim, a man who had sacrificed everything to protect his father's name and, perhaps, to protect her. "Why did you not show this to my father?" she asked, her voice still trembling. "Why wait until now?" Tristan's expression darkened. "I tried, my lady. I begged him to listen, to examine the evidence. But he refused. He was blinded by his grief, by his trust in Elric. And Elric, he was always there, whispering in his ear, reinforcing his suspicions." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "After your father's death, I knew I could not reveal the truth. Elric would have killed me, and the evidence would have been destroyed. I had to wait, to bide my time, to find the right opportunity to expose him." Catherine nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Tristan had been playing a dangerous game, a game of survival and deception. He had lived under Elric's shadow, enduring his cruelty and suspicion, all the while searching for a way to clear his father's name and bring the true killer to justice. She looked at the parchments again, at the evidence that had been hidden for so long. The whispers in the stone, the secrets that had haunted Dunmere, were finally coming to light. "What do you propose we do?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. Tristan stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers. "We must expose Elric," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "We must reveal his treachery to the other lords, to the king himself. We must bring him to justice, for your father's sake, for my father's sake, and for the future of Dunmere." He paused, his gaze softening. "But we must be careful, my lady. Elric is powerful, and he has many allies. We cannot act rashly. We must plan our moves carefully, gather support, and strike at the right moment." Catherine nodded, her mind already racing, formulating plans, considering alliances. She had spent years consumed by grief and anger, feeling helpless and alone. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of purpose. She had an ally, a partner in this fight. "We will do it together," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "We will avenge our fathers, and we will reclaim what is rightfully ours." She looked at Tristan, her gaze lingering on his face. The lines of hardship, the shadows in his eyes, spoke of a man who had endured much, who had suffered greatly. But beneath that surface, she saw a strength, a resilience, that she had not recognized before. And in that moment, something shifted within her. The ice that had encased her heart began to melt, replaced by a warmth, a connection that she had not expected. She had found an ally in her enemy and a future she did not expect. It was terrifying. Chapter 4. The Serpent's Kiss. The days that followed were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and whispered conversations. Catherine and Tristan, Once adversaries separated by a chasm of mistrust, now found themselves bound together by a shared purpose, their alliance forged in the crucible of shared grief and a burning desire for justice. They worked in secret, poring over maps, analyzing Alric's strengths and weaknesses, and identifying potential allies among the other noble houses. The Solar, once a sanctuary of solitude for Catherine, became their war room, the air thick with the scent of parchment and candle wax, the silence punctuated by the scratching of quills and the hushed murmur of their voices. They spoke of their fathers, of their childhoods, of the dreams they had once held, dreams that had been shattered by Alric's treachery. As they worked, Catherine found herself studying Tristan, observing the subtle nuances of his expressions, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the flicker of pain that crossed his eyes when he spoke of his father. She began to see him not as the enemy she had imagined, but as a man of deep integrity, a man who had been wronged, a man who was fighting for the same things she was. Tristan, in turn, was drawn to Catherine's strength and resilience. He had expected to find a grieving, embittered woman, consumed by hatred and despair. Instead, he found a leader, a woman who had borne the weight of responsibility with grace and determination, a woman who was willing to fight for her people, for her birthright. He admired her courage, her intelligence, her unwavering commitment to justice. One evening, as they sat by the fire, poring over a map of the surrounding territories, Catherine noticed a small, faded scar on Tristan's hand, a thin white line that ran across his knuckles. "How did you get that?" she asked, her voice soft, her fingers tracing the outline of the scar almost without her realizing it. Tristan glanced at his hand, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had forgotten about the scar, a memento of a long-ago battle, a minor wound compared to the deeper scars he carried within. "It was during a skirmish with some border raiders," he said, his voice low. "Years ago, when I was still a squire." Catherine's fingers lingered on his hand, the warmth of his skin sending an unexpected shiver through her. She quickly withdrew her hand, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "I apologize," she stammered, feeling flustered. "I did not mean to pry." Tristan smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. "It is no secret, my lady. I have many scars, both visible and invisible." Catherine met his gaze, her heart beating faster. She saw a vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of the pain he had carried for so long. And in that moment, she felt a connection to him, a deep and profound empathy that transcended their shared purpose, their alliance. "We all carry scars, Tristan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is the burden of living in this world." Their eyes locked, and for a long moment, the world outside the Solar seemed to fade away. The crackling of the fire, the rustling of the parchments, the distant sounds of the castle, all receded into the background. There was only the two of them, bound together by a shared pain, a shared hope, and something more. The moment was broken by a knock on the door. Alara entered, her face etched with concern. "My lady," she said, "a messenger has arrived from Lord Ashton. He requests an urgent audience." Catherine sighed, the spell broken. The weight of responsibility settled back upon her shoulders. "Very well, Alara. Show him in." Lord Ashton was a powerful nobleman whose lands bordered both Dunmere and Blackwood. He had remained neutral in the conflict between Catherine and Elric, carefully weighing his options, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. His support could be crucial to their cause. Ashton entered the Solar, his expression guarded. He greeted Catherine with a formal bow, his gaze flickering to Tristan, who stood silently by the fireplace. "Lady Catherine," Ashton began, his voice smooth and diplomatic, "I have received a disturbing message from Lord Elric." Catherine's heart sank. She had a feeling she knew what was coming. "He claims," Ashton continued, "that Sir Tristan de Clare is a traitor, a fugitive from justice. He demands that you surrender him to Blackwood, to face trial for his crimes." Catherine felt a surge of anger. Elric was playing his hand, attempting to isolate her, to weaken her position. Lord Elric's claims are false, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Sir Tristan is here under my protection. He is my guest and my ally. Ashton raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. My lady, I understand your loyalty to your guest. But Lord Elric is a powerful man. He has the backing of several other lords. To defy him could be dangerous. Catherine met his gaze, her chin held high. I am not afraid of Lord Elric, she said. And I will not betray a man who has proven his loyalty to me, to the memory of my father. Ashton sighed. My lady, I urge you to reconsider. Lord Elric has offered a generous alliance. He proposes a marriage between you and his heir, a union that would secure peace between Dunmere and Blackwood. Catherine felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Elric's offer was a trap, a serpent's kiss disguised as a peace treaty. He wanted to control Dunmere, to absorb it into his domain. And he was using Tristan as a pawn in his game. I will never marry into the house that murdered my father, she said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. Tell Lord Elric that his offer is refused. And tell him that I am not afraid to fight for what is rightfully mine. Ashton bowed his head. As you wish, my lady. But I fear you are making a grave mistake. Lord Elric is not a man to be trifled with. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. One more thing, my lady, he said, his voice low. Lord Elric has also offered a substantial reward for Sir Tristan's capture, dead or alive. He departed, leaving Catherine and Tristan alone in the silence of the solar. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of the danger they faced. Elric had made his move. The game had begun. And Tristan, a key, valuable asset, was officially a target. Chapter 5. Scars of the Past. The news of Elric's bounty on Tristan's had cast a long shadow over Dunmere. The castle, already tense with the undercurrent of impending conflict, became a fortress of wary eyes and hushed whispers. Catherine doubled the guard, restricting access to the castle and ordering patrols along the perimeter. She knew that Elric would not hesitate to use any means necessary to get his hands on Tristan, and the reward he had offered would be a tempting lure for mercenaries and bounty hunters. Despite the increased security, Catherine felt a growing unease. She trusted her guards, but she knew that loyalty could be bought, that even the most steadfast walls could be breached. She found herself constantly watching Tristan, her gaze lingering on him whenever he was near, a mixture of concern and something else, something she couldn't quite define, swirling within her. Tristan, for his part, seemed to bear the weight of the bounty with a stoic calm. He continued to work with Catherine, poring over maps and strategizing, his focus unwavering. But she noticed subtle changes in his demeanor, a heightened alertness, a slight tension in his shoulders, the way he always positioned himself between her and the door, as if shielding her from any potential threat. One afternoon, as they were working in the solar, Catherine found Tristan staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. The sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, highlighting the lines of weariness etched on his face. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft, breaking the silence. Tristan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I was thinking about my father," he said, his voice low. "About how he used to take me hunting in those hills when I was a boy. He taught me everything I know about tracking, about survival." Catherine nodded, her heart aching for him. She remembered her own father, the lessons he had taught her, the love and guidance he had given her. "He would be proud of you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "for fighting for his name, for seeking justice." Tristan smiled, a bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope so, my lady. I hope I can live up to his memory." He paused, his gaze shifting back to the window. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it," he said, his voice barely audible. "All this fighting, all this bloodshed. Is it worth the cost?" Catherine felt a pang of empathy. She had asked herself the same question many times, especially in the dark hours of the night, when the weight of responsibility seemed almost unbearable. "It is," she said, her voice firm, her conviction unwavering. "We cannot let evil triumph. We cannot let Elric get away with what he has done. We must fight for what is right, for what we believe in. Tristan met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. He saw a strength in her, a fire that burned bright despite the darkness that surrounded them. And he found himself drawing strength from her unwavering belief in justice. "You are right, my lady," he said, his voice regaining its firmness. "We must fight, and we will win." He turned away from the window and walked over to the table, where a map of the region was spread out. He pointed to a small, isolated valley, nestled between two towering peaks. "There is a hidden passage here," he said, his finger tracing the outline of the valley. "It leads through the mountains to the lands of Lord Arian. He is a man of honor, a man who despises Elric. If we can reach him, we might be able to secure his support." Catherine studied the map, her mind racing. It was a risky plan, a dangerous journey through treacherous terrain. But it was also their best hope of gaining a powerful ally. "It's a long shot," she said, her voice hesitant. "But it might be worth the risk." Tristan nodded. "I agree. We should leave as soon as possible, before Elric can tighten his grip on the region." They spent the rest of the afternoon making preparations, gathering supplies, and choosing a small, trusted escort. Catherine insisted on accompanying Tristan, despite his protests. She would not let him face this danger alone. As evening approached, Catherine found herself alone in her chambers, preparing for the journey. She changed into a simple, practical riding outfit, discarding her usual finery. She braided her hair tightly, securing it with a leather thong. She strapped a dagger to her belt, a small but sharp weapon she had learned to use from Sir Reginald. As she looked in the mirror, she saw a different woman staring back at her. Gone was the grieving, hesitant lady of Dunmere. In her place was a warrior, a leader, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. A knock on the door startled her. It was Alara, her face etched with worry. "My lady," she said, "are you sure about this? It is a dangerous journey. You could be killed." Catherine smiled, a reassuring smile that belied the fear she felt inside. "I will be fine, Alara," she said. "I have Tristan with me, and I have faith that we will succeed." Alara hugged her tightly, her tears wetting Catherine's shoulder. "Be careful, my lady," she whispered. "Come back to us." Catherine hugged her back, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. She knew that she was risking everything, her life, her future. But she also knew that she had no choice. She had to fight, for her people, for her father, for Tristan. She left her chambers, her steps firm and resolute. She met Tristan in the courtyard, where their escort was waiting. He was mounted on a sturdy warhorse, his sword at his hip, his expression grim but determined. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a silent question. Catherine nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I am ready," she said. They mounted their horses and rode out of the castle gates, under the cover of darkness, leaving behind the safety of Dunmere and venturing into the unknown. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, eerie shadows as they rode, the only sound the rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves and the whispers of the wind through the trees. The road ahead was uncertain. Chapter 6. The Falcon's Flight. The journey through the mountains was arduous and perilous. The narrow, winding paths clung precariously to the steep slopes, with sheer drops on one side and towering rock faces on the other. The air was thin and cold, the wind whipping around them with a biting ferocity. They rode for days, pushing their horses to their limits, stopping only for brief periods of rest and sustenance. Catherine, despite her upbringing in the relative comfort of Dunmere, proved to be a resilient and resourceful traveler. She endured the hardships without complaint, her determination unwavering. She learned to ride with confidence, her body adapting to the rhythm of the horse, her senses attuned to the dangers of the mountain terrain. Tristan was impressed by her resilience, by her quiet strength. He had expected her to be fragile, to need coddling. Instead, he found a companion, a warrior in her own right, someone who could share the burdens of the journey and face the dangers alongside him. They spoke little during the long hours of writing, conserving their energy, their communication often limited to a shared glance, a brief touch of hands as they helped each other navigate a difficult passage. But in those silent exchanges, a bond was forming, a deep and unspoken understanding that transcended words. One evening, as they were camped in a small, sheltered cave, high in the mountains, Catherine found Tristan sharpening his sword, the rhythmic rasp of steel against stone filling the silence. She sat beside him, watching him work, her gaze lingering on his strong, capable hands. "You are skilled with a blade," she said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. Tristan looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had not realized she was watching him. "It is a necessary skill," he said, his voice low. "In my life, I have had to defend myself many times." Catherine nodded, her gaze shifting to the sword. She remembered the day she had seen him standing beside Elric, his sword unbloodied, but his eyes reflecting a cold, unreadable light. She had believed him to be a traitor then, a murderer. Now, she knew better. Have you ever killed a man?" she asked, her voice hesitant, the question hanging in the air. Tristan paused, his hand stilling on the blade. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
"I have.
Many times." He sheathed his sword, the metallic click echoing in the silence of the cave. "It is not something I take pleasure in," he said, his voice low. "But sometimes it is necessary. To protect oneself, to protect others." Catherine nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. She had never killed anyone, but she knew that she would, if she had to. To protect her people, to protect Tristan. "I understand," she said, her voice firm. "Sometimes there is no other choice." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the small fire they had built, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The vastness of the night sky, studded with countless stars, stretched above them, a silent witness to their journey, to their struggle. "We are close," Tristan said, breaking the silence. "To Lord Arian's lands. Another day's ride, perhaps two." Catherine nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Arian was their best chance of gaining an ally, of turning the tide against Elric. But he was also a powerful and unpredictable lord, a man who valued his own interests above all else. "Do you think he will help us?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Tristan shrugged.
"I do not know," he said.
"But we must try. We have nothing to lose." He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. He saw a strength in her, a determination that matched his own. And he felt a surge of protectiveness, a desire to shield her from the dangers that lay ahead. "We will face him together," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, we will face it together." Catherine smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers lingering on his. "Together," she repeated, her voice filled with a newfound confidence. They continued their journey the next day, their spirits lifted by the prospect of reaching Arian's lands. As they rode, they spotted a falcon soaring high above them, its wings outstretched, gliding effortlessly on the wind currents. Catherine watched the falcon, her gaze filled with admiration. "It is a beautiful creature," she said, her voice filled with awe. "So free, so powerful." Tristan nodded. "The falcon is a symbol of strength and freedom," he said. "It is also the emblem of Lord Arian's house." He looked at Catherine, his eyes meeting hers. "Perhaps it is a sign," he said, his voice hopeful. "A sign that we are on the right path, that we will find the help we need." Catherine smiled, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. The falcon's flight, a symbol of freedom and strength, seemed to mirror their own journey, their own quest for justice. They rode on, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts filled with a shared determination, their bond strengthened by the shared dangers they had faced, by the unspoken promise of what lay ahead. The falcon continued to circle, a silent, watchful guardian above them, a promising, soaring shadow. Chapter 7. Echoes of Treachery. Lord Arian's stronghold, nestled in a high valley ringed by snow-capped peaks, was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Dunmere. While Dunmere was built for elegance as much as defense, Arian's fortress was purely functional, grim, gray stone walls, devoid of ornamentation, and a single, imposing gate guarded by heavily armed soldiers. The air itself seemed colder here, the wind whistling a harsher tune through the narrow passes. As they approached the gate, Tristan raised a hand, signaling their escort to halt. He rode forward alone, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral. He announced himself to the guards, stating his name and his purpose to seek an audience with Lord Arian. The guards, their faces hardened by years of battling both the elements and their lord's enemies, eyed him with suspicion. After a tense silence, one of them disappeared inside the gatehouse, returning moments later with a gruff command to follow. Tristan rejoined Catherine and their escort, his face unreadable. "They will allow us to enter," he said, his voice low. "But be wary. Arian is known for his unpredictability." The gate creaked open, revealing a courtyard bustling with activity. Soldiers drilled with swords and spears, blacksmiths hammered at their forges, and stable hands tended to a collection of sturdy mountain horses. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and steel. They were led to a large, austere hall, where Lord Arian awaited them. He was a man of imposing stature, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick, black beard streaked with gray and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess their worth with a single glance. He sat on a simple wooden throne, a massive warhammer resting across his lap. "Sir Tristan de Clare," Arian said, his voice a deep rumble that echoed through the hall. "A name I have heard whispered in connection with treachery and betrayal. What brings you to my lands?" Tristan met his gaze, unflinching. "I come to seek your aid, Lord Arian," he said, his voice clear and strong. "To expose the true traitor, the man who murdered Baron Alaric of Dunmere, Lord Elric of Blackwood." Arian's eyes narrowed. "Elric? A bold accusation, Sir Knight. What proof do you have?" Tristan gestured to Catherine, who stepped forward. "I am Lady Catherine of Dunmere," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "And I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. Evidence that proves Elric's guilt and Sir Tristan's innocence." Arian listened as Tristan and Catherine recounted their story, presenting the documents they had brought with them: Elric's letter to Sir Gareth, the forged reply, Tristan's confession, and Catherine's mother's plea. He examined the parchments carefully, his expression inscrutable. As they spoke, Catherine noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the hall. The guards, who had initially been openly hostile, seemed to relax slightly, their eyes flickering between Tristan and Arian with a flicker of something akin to respect. When they had finished, Arian remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the documents in his hands. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with anticipation. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting Tristan's. "These are compelling accusations," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "But I have also heard rumors of a bounty on your head, Sir Tristan. A substantial reward offered by Lord Elric for your capture." Tristan nodded. "Elric seeks to silence me, to prevent me from revealing the truth." Arian leaned back in his throne, his gaze sweeping over Catherine and Tristan. "I have always distrusted Elric," he said, his voice a low growl. "He is a snake, a viper in the grass. But I am also a cautious man. I do not make alliances lightly." He paused, his eyes lingering on Catherine. "You say you have seen the evidence with your own eyes, Lady Catherine. You believe Sir Tristan to be innocent?" Catherine met his gaze, her chin held high. "I do," she said, her voice unwavering. "I trust him with my life." Arian studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his gaze back to Tristan. "Very well," he said, his voice firm. "I will hear your proposal. But know this, Sir Knight, if you betray me, if you prove to be a liar, you will face my wrath. And my wrath is not something to be trifled with." He gestured to a nearby table, where a servant had placed flagons of ale and platters of bread and cheese. "Let us eat and drink," he said, "and discuss how we can bring down a common enemy." As they ate, Tristan outlined his plan to expose Elric's treachery to the other lords of the realm, to gather support for a formal accusation before the king. Arion listened intently, asking shrewd questions, probing for weaknesses in their strategy. He agreed to provide them with shelter and protection, allowing them to remain in his stronghold while they sent messengers to other potential allies. He also offered to lend them a small contingent of his own soldiers, seasoned warriors who knew the mountain passes and could help them navigate the treacherous terrain. But as the evening wore on, Catherine sensed a subtle undercurrent of tension beneath Arion's gruff hospitality. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on Tristan, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, suspicion, perhaps, or something more, something darker. During the night, as she would not sleep, she heard a man's voice. It reminded her of Elric, somehow. Later, as they were preparing to retire for the night, Catherine pulled Tristan aside, her voice low and urgent. "I do not trust him, Tristan," she said. "I sense something off. Something he is not telling us." Tristan nodded, his expression troubled. "I agree," he said. "I have felt it too. We must be careful, Catherine. We must watch our backs." They agreed to keep their suspicions to themselves, to avoid arousing Arion's distrust. But as they went to their separate chambers, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her, a cold premonition of danger lurking in the shadows of Arion's fortress. The echoes of treachery, it seemed, were not confined to the past. They resonated in the present, a chilling reminder that trust was a fragile commodity in a world ruled by power and ambition. Chapter 8. Beneath the Cloak of Night. Sleep eluded Catherine. The unfamiliar surroundings, the weight of their mission, and the lingering unease about Lord Arion kept her tossing and turning in the narrow bed provided for her. The room was small and sparsely furnished, the stone walls cold and damp. A single window, high up on the wall, offered a sliver of moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. She rose from the bed, wrapping a thick woolen cloak around her shoulders. She paced the room, her mind racing, replaying the events of the day, trying to decipher Arion's true intentions. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, that their alliance with him was a dangerous gamble. The sound of a floorboard creaking outside her door startled her. She froze, her hand instinctively moving to the dagger she kept hidden beneath her pillow. She held her breath, listening intently. A soft knock echoed through the room. "Catherine?" A familiar voice whispered. It was Tristan. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a renewed sense of unease. Why was he here, in the middle of the night? She opened the door cautiously, peering out into the dimly lit corridor. Tristan stood there, his face shadowed, his expression troubled. "I could not sleep," he said, his voice low. "I had to see you, to make sure you were all right." Catherine stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "I am fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I share your concerns about Arion. I do not trust him." Tristan nodded, his gaze sweeping the room, as if checking for hidden dangers.
"He is hiding something," he said.
I saw it in his eyes, in the way he spoke of Elric. He knows more than he is letting on. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "I overheard a conversation earlier," he said, his voice barely audible, "between Arion and one of his captains. They spoke of a messenger sent to Blackwood." Catherine's heart sank. Her suspicions were confirmed. Arion was playing a double game, betraying them to Elric. "We must leave," she said, her voice urgent. "We must leave now, before it is too late." Tristan nodded. "I agree. I have already alerted our escort. They are preparing the horses." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her. "We will leave through a secret passage," he said. "One that leads out of the fortress into the mountains. It is our only chance." They crept out of the room, their movements silent and stealthy. They made their way through the darkened corridors, avoiding the guards, their hearts pounding in their chests. The fortress was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional snore of a sleeping soldier, the distant howl of a wolf. They reached the stables, where their escort was waiting, the horses saddled and ready. Tristan helped Catherine mount, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. They rode out of the stables, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. They followed Tristan through a narrow passage, hidden behind a tapestry in a deserted section of the fortress. The passage led them to a small, concealed gate, opening onto a steep, winding path that descended into the valley below. As they rode, Catherine looked back at the fortress, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. She felt a mixture of relief and regret. Relief at escaping Arian's trap, regret at losing a potential ally. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the wind carrying her words away. Tristan turned to her, his face grim. "We must reach Lord Reynard," he said. "He is the only one who can help us now. He is a man of honor, a man who will not betray us." Reynard was a powerful lord, whose lands lay to the east, beyond the mountains. He was known for his integrity and his fierce independence, a man who had resisted Elric's attempts to control him. The journey to Reynard's lands would be even more perilous than their previous trek. They would have to cross enemy territory, avoiding Elric's patrols, relying on their wits and their skills to survive. As they rode, the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, casting a pale glow over the snow-capped peaks. The mountains, once a refuge, now seemed menacing, their shadows concealing hidden dangers. Suddenly, a shout rang out from behind them.
"Stop them!
They are escaping!" Catherine turned, her heart leaping into her throat. A group of Arian soldiers were pursuing them, their swords glinting in the early morning light. Arian's betrayal was complete. They were trapped, caught between the treachery of one lord and the ambition of another. The cloak of night, which had offered them a brief respite, was lifting, revealing the harsh reality of their desperate situation. The hunt was on once again.
Chapter 9.
The Price of Loyalty.
Ride!
Tristan shouted, his voice ringing with urgency. "Ride as fast as you can." He spurred his horse forward, leading the way, Catherine and their small escort following close behind. The horses' hooves pounded on the rocky path, the sound echoing through the narrow valley. The pursuing soldiers were gaining on them, their shouts and the clang of their weapons growing closer. Catherine's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She clung to the reins, her knuckles white, her body swaying with the horse's movements. She had never ridden so fast, so recklessly in her life. Tristan glanced back, his face grim. He saw the fear in Catherine's eyes, but also the determination. He knew that she would not give up, that she would fight to the end. "We must reach the pass," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the wind and the pounding hooves. "It is our only chance." The pass was a narrow defile, a natural choke point in the mountains, where they could make a stand, where their small numbers would be less of a disadvantage. They rode on, the pursuing soldiers hot on their heels. Arrows whizzed past them, some striking the rocks around them, others finding their mark in the flesh of their horses. One of their escort was hit, falling from his horse with a cry of pain. Catherine felt a surge of grief and anger. She had known these men, had trusted them. They were dying for her, for their loyalty to Dunmere. They reached the pass, a narrow gap between two towering cliffs. Tristan reined in his horse, turning to face the pursuing soldiers. "Make your stand here," he shouted to their remaining escort. "Fight for your lives. Fight for Dunmere." He drew his sword, the steel gleaming in the morning light. Catherine drew her dagger, her hand trembling but her resolve firm. She would fight alongside Tristan. She would defend herself. She would not be taken captive. The soldiers charged, their weapons raised, their faces contorted with fury. The clash of steel echoed through the pass, the air filled with the cries of men and the screams of horses. Tristan fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his sword a blur of motion, deflecting blows, striking down opponents. He was a skilled warrior, honed by years of training and battle. But he was outnumbered, surrounded by enemies. Catherine fought beside him, her dagger flashing, striking at any soldier who came too close. She was not as skilled as Tristan, but she was agile and quick, her movements driven by adrenaline and fear. One of the soldiers, a burly man with a scarred face, lunged at her, his sword aimed at her heart. Catherine dodged the blow, her dagger finding its mark in his arm. He roared in pain, dropping his sword. But another soldier took his place, and another, and another. Catherine was overwhelmed, forced to retreat, her back pressed against the cold, hard rock of the cliff face. She saw Tristan fighting a few feet away, surrounded by enemies, his sword arm bleeding, his face streaked with sweat and blood. He was tiring, slowing down. He would not last much longer. A soldier broke through his guard, his sword slashing across Tristan's chest. Tristan staggered, falling to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. Catherine screamed, a desperate cry of anguish and fury. She lunged forward, her dagger aimed at the soldier's back. But another soldier intercepted her, his sword knocking her dagger from her hand. She was disarmed, defenseless. The soldier raised his sword, ready to strike the killing blow. Suddenly, a figure leaped in front of her, shielding her with his body. It was Sir Reginald, the captain of the guard from Dunmere, who had ridden with them. Reginald took the blow meant for Catherine, the sword piercing his chest. He gasped, his eyes meeting Catherine's, a flicker of a smile on his lips. For Dunmere, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then he collapsed, his body falling lifelessly to the ground. Catherine stared at him, her mind numb with shock and grief. Reginald, her loyal protector, had sacrificed himself to save her. The price of loyalty, she realized, was often paid in blood. The remaining soldiers of their escort were quickly overwhelmed, cut down by the superior numbers of Arian's men. Catherine and Tristan were captured, their hands bound, their weapons taken from them. The captain of Arian's guard, a cruel-looking man with a cold smile, approached them. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what we have here. The traitor knight and the runaway lady. Lord Arian will be pleased. He gestured to his men. Take them back to the fortress, he ordered. And make sure they do not escape again. Catherine and Tristan were dragged roughly to their feet, their bodies aching, their spirits broken. They were forced to mount their horses, their hands still bound, and were led back to Arian's stronghold, prisoners of the man they had once hoped would be their ally. As they rode, Catherine looked back at the pass, at the bodies of their fallen comrades. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. Their mission had failed. Their hopes had been crushed. They were at the mercy of their enemies. But even in her despair, a spark of defiance remained. She would not give up. She would not surrender. She would find a way to escape, to fight back, to avenge the deaths of those who had died for her. She looked at Tristan, and she was grateful he was alive. It gave her something to fight for. Chapter 10. A Dance of Shadows. The return to Arian's fortress was a grim procession. Catherine and Tristan, bound and surrounded by guards, were paraded through the courtyard like trophies of war. The faces of the soldiers and servants, once cautiously welcoming, were now openly hostile, reflecting the fickle nature of loyalty in a world ruled by power. Arian awaited them in the great hall, his expression a mask of cold satisfaction. He sat on his throne, the warhammer resting across his lap, a symbol of his brutal authority. So, he said, his voice a low rumble, the falcon attempts to fly, only to be caught in the hunter's net. You disappoint me, Sir Tristan. I had hoped for a more entertaining chase. Tristan met his gaze, his expression defiant despite his captivity. You betrayed us, Arian, he said, his voice firm. You broke your word. Arian chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. Words are wind, Sir Knight. Loyalty is a commodity, to be bought and sold. Elric offered a better price. He turned his gaze to Catherine, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory gleam. And you, Lady Catherine, he said, his voice softening, you are a valuable prize indeed. Elric is most eager to acquire you. He has promised me a handsome reward for your safe return. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. She had known that Elric wanted her, but to hear it spoken so plainly, so callously, was a different matter entirely. She was a pawn in their game, a prize to be won or lost. "I will never be Auric's prize," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I would rather die than submit to him." Arion smiled, a cruel, knowing smile.
"Such spirit," he said.
"It is admirable, but ultimately futile. You are in my power now, my lady, and I will deliver you to Elric as promised." He gestured to his guards. "Take them away," he ordered. "Lock them in the dungeon, and make sure they are well guarded." The dungeon was a dark, damp, and oppressive place, the air thick with the stench of mildew and decay. Catherine and Tristan were thrown into separate cells, their hands still bound, their bodies aching from the rough treatment they had received. Catherine's cell was small and cramped, the only light filtering through a tiny, barred window high up on the wall. The floor was cold and damp, the stone walls covered in a layer of slimy moss. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her mind numb with despair. She thought of her father, of her people, of the hope she had carried for so long, the hope that had now been extinguished. She thought of Reginald, of the other soldiers who had died for her, their sacrifices seemingly in vain. She closed her eyes, tears welling up, blurring her vision. She felt utterly alone, utterly defeated. A faint sound startled her, a soft tapping, coming from the wall beside her. She held her breath, listening intently. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was a code, a simple rhythmic pattern. It was Tristan. Catherine pressed her ear against the wall, her heart beating faster. She tapped back, repeating the code, signaling that she had heard him. "Catherine?" Tristan's voice whispered, barely audible through the thick stone. "Are you all right?" I am alive," she whispered back, her voice trembling.
But, I fear this is the end."
"No," Tristan's voice was firm, resolute. "It is not the end. We will not give up. We will find a way out of this." They communicated in whispers, sharing their fears, their hopes, their determination to survive. Tristan told her that he had been trying to loosen the ropes binding his hands, that he had managed to free one hand. He was working on the other, hoping to find a way to escape his cell. Catherine's spirits lifted slightly, buoyed by Tristan's unwavering resolve. He was her strength, her hope, her anchor in this dark and desperate situation. They continued to communicate in whispers, planning, strategizing, waiting for an opportunity to escape. They knew that their chances were slim, that the odds were stacked against them. But they would not surrender. They would fight to the end. As the hours passed, Catherine heard the sounds of activity in the corridor outside her cell. The guards were changing shifts, their footsteps echoing through the dungeon. She held her breath, listening intently. Suddenly, she heard a muffled cry, followed by a thud.
Then, silence.
"Catherine?" Tristan's voice whispered, urgent and strained. "Are you there?" "Yes," she whispered back. "What happened?" I managed to overpower my guard," Tristan said, his voice breathless. "I am free. I am coming for you." Catherine's heart leaped with hope. Tristan was free. He was coming for her. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching her cell, the jingle of keys. The door creaked open, and Tristan stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. He was bruised and battered, his clothes torn, but his eyes were filled with a fierce determination. He held a sword in his hand, the blade gleaming in the darkness. He reached out and cut the ropes binding her hands. Catherine stood up, her legs shaky, her body aching. "We must go," Tristan said, his voice urgent. "We must leave now, before they discover what has happened." They crept out of the cell, their movements silent and stealthy. They made their way through the darkened corridors of the dungeon, avoiding the remaining guards, their hearts pounding in their chests. The dance of shadows, this game of cat and mouse, continued, but this time, they were the hunters, not the hunted. They were the mice, however, who were one false step away from death. Chapter 11. The Lion's Roar. Their escape from the dungeon was a tense, nerve-wracking affair. Every creaking floorboard, every distant cough, every flicker of torchlight sent jolts of adrenaline through them. Tristan, With his knowledge of the fortress layout gained during their brief, ill-fated alliance with Arian, guided them through a maze of corridors and hidden passages, avoiding the main thoroughfares where guards were more likely to be present. Catherine, despite her fear, marveled at Tristan's resourcefulness and his calm demeanor under pressure. He moved with a quiet confidence, his senses alert to any sign of danger, his hand never far from the hilt of the sword he had taken from the guard. They finally reached a small, disused postern gate, hidden behind a tangle of overgrown vines. Tristan, using the guard's keys, managed to unlock the rusty mechanism, the gate creaking open with a groan that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. They slipped out into the darkness, finding themselves on a narrow, rocky path that led down into the valley below. They paused for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, the scent of pine and damp earth filling their lungs. They were free, at least for the moment. "We must make for the forest," Tristan said, his voice low, gesturing towards a dense stand of trees that loomed in the distance. "It will offer us cover." They set off at a brisk pace, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, eerie shadows that danced around them, making it difficult to see. Suddenly, a horn blared from the fortress, the sound echoing through the valley, shattering the silence. The alarm had been raised. Their escape had been discovered. "They know we are gone," Catherine said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of urgency. "We must hurry." They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, the sound of the horns spurring them on. They could hear the shouts of soldiers behind them, the pounding of hooves, the baying of hounds. The hunt was on again. They reached the edge of the forest, plunging into the dense undergrowth, the branches and thorns tearing at their clothes, scratching their skin. The darkness was almost complete, the trees blocking out the moonlight, making it difficult to see where they were going. They stumbled and fell, their hands and knees scraping against the rough ground. But they kept going, driven by a primal instinct to survive. Tristan, using his skills as a tracker, led them through the tangled undergrowth, following a barely discernible path, his senses alert to any sign of pursuit. They came to a small stream, its waters gurgling over smooth stones. They paused for a moment, drinking deeply, splashing the cool water on their faces, washing away the grime and sweat of their escape. As they were resting, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps, the snapping of twigs, the heavy breathing of men. The soldiers were closing in. Tristan drew his sword, his expression grim. "We must fight," he said, his voice low. "We have no other choice." Catherine nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no weapon, but she would fight with her bare hands if necessary. She would not be taken captive again. The soldiers emerged from the trees, their swords drawn, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their torches. They were led by the captain of Arian's guard, the same cruel-looking man who had captured them before. "There they are," the captain shouted. "Do not let them escape." The soldiers charged, their weapons raised, their faces contorted with fury. Tristan met them head-on, his sword flashing in the darkness, deflecting blows, striking down opponents. He fought with a skill and ferocity that belied his exhaustion, his movements driven by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect Catherine. Catherine, seeing an opportunity, picked up a large, fallen branch, using it as a makeshift weapon. She swung it at the legs of the approaching soldiers, tripping them, disrupting their attack. They fought back to back, Tristan protecting Catherine, Catherine protecting Tristan, their movements coordinated, their trust in each other absolute. But they were outnumbered, surrounded by enemies. Tristan was tiring, his movements slowing down, his sword arm bleeding. Catherine was bruised and battered, her strength waning. Suddenly, a roar echoed through the forest, a sound so loud, so powerful, that it made the ground tremble. It was not the roar of a beast, but the roar of a man, a roar filled with rage and fury. A figure emerged from the trees, a giant of a man, clad in shining armor, his face hidden behind a visored helmet. He wielded a massive warhammer, the same weapon that Lord Arion had carried. But this was not Arion. This was someone else, someone far more formidable. The figure charged into the fray, his warhammer smashing into the soldiers, sending them flying like rag dolls. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his size, his blows crushing bones, shattering weapons. The soldiers, terrified by this sudden onslaught, began to retreat, their discipline breaking, their courage failing. The figure turned his attention to Tristan and Catherine, his helmeted gaze fixed on them. He lowered his warhammer, his voice booming through the forest. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice muffled by the helmet, but filled with a concern that was unmistakable. Tristan lowered his sword, his eyes widening in recognition. "Reynard?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Is that you?" The figure removed his helmet, revealing a face that was both familiar and unexpected. It was indeed Lord Reynard, the man they had been seeking, the man who was their last hope. Reynard smiled, a grim smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "It seems I arrived just in time," he said, his voice booming. "The lion has roared, and the jackals have fled." He came because he had received an anonymous message. Chapter 12. Between Two Fires. Reynard's arrival was like a storm breaking sudden, violent, and utterly transformative. The remnants of Arion's pursuing force scattered into the darkness, their fear of the legendary Lord Reynard overriding their loyalty to their treacherous master. The forest, moments before a scene of desperate struggle, fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of those who remained and the rustling of leaves in the night wind. Reynard, dismounting his warhorse, approached Tristan and Catherine, his eyes scanning them for injuries. He was a man built for battle, his presence radiating strength and authority, yet his concern for their well-being was genuine. "You were followed," Reynard stated, his voice a deep rumble, less a question than an observation. "Arion's treachery runs deeper than I anticipated. An anonymous message warned me of your plight, speaking of betrayal and a desperate flight. I rode with all haste." Tristan, leaning heavily on his sword, managed a weak smile. "We are in your debt, Lord Reynard." Without your intervention, he didn't finish the sentence, the unspoken alternative hanging heavy in the air. Catherine, still shaken from the fight, found her voice. "We came seeking your aid, Lord Reynard, to expose Auric's crimes and Arion's complicity." Reynard nodded, his gaze hardening. "Auric's ambition has poisoned this land for too long. Arion, it seems, has finally chosen his side, the losing side." He gestured to his men, a small but elite force, who had remained mounted and watchful. "We will return to my stronghold. You'll be safe there, and we can plan our next move." The journey to Reynard's fortress was a stark contrast to their desperate flight from Arion's. They traveled at a more measured pace, Reynard's men forming a protective cordon around them. Catherine, exhausted but relieved, found herself riding beside Reynard, the imposing lord surprisingly gentle and attentive. "The message you received," Catherine began, her curiosity piqued. "Do you know who sent it?" Reynard shook his head. "It was unsigned, delivered by a hooded rider who vanished as quickly as he appeared. The message spoke of truth and justice, of a knight betrayed, and a lady in peril. It bore the mark of someone who knew the intricacies of courtly intrigue, yet chose to remain hidden." Catherine pondered this, her mind racing. Who would have known of their plight, and who would have risked contacting Reynard, knowing the dangers involved? The possibilities swirled in her head, a mix of allies and potential enemies. They reached Reynard's stronghold, a fortress carved into the side of a mountain, even more imposing than Arion's as dawn was breaking. The rising sun cast a golden glow on the stone walls, a beacon of hope after the darkness they had endured. Inside, they were treated with respect and care. Their wounds were tended to, fresh clothes were provided, and they were given food and drink. Catherine, finally able to relax, felt the exhaustion of the past few days wash over her. Later, as she and Tristan were recovering in a private chamber, they discussed the mysterious message. "Someone is watching us," Tristan, Catherine said, her voice low. "Someone who knows more than they are letting on." Tristan nodded, his expression thoughtful. It could be a friend, or it could be a trap. We must be careful, Catherine. We cannot trust anyone completely. Their conversation was interrupted by a summons from Reynard. They found him in his war room, a large, circular chamber with maps spread across a massive table. He was studying the maps intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I've been assessing the situation," Reynard said, his voice grim. "Elric is consolidating his power. He has already secured alliances with several other lords, and his army grows stronger by the day. Arian's betrayal has made our task even more difficult." He looked at Tristan and Catherine, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "We are between two fires," he said. "Elric to the south, Arian to the west. We must act quickly and decisively." He outlined his plan. He would send messengers to the remaining unaligned lords, urging them to join their cause. He would also send a formal accusation to the king, detailing Elric's crimes and demanding justice. But he knew that the king was weak, easily swayed by powerful lords like Elric. "Our best hope," Reynard said, "is to gather enough support to challenge Elric directly, to force a confrontation, to expose his treachery before the entire realm." It was a bold plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. Catherine and Tristan exchanged a look. They knew the risks, the dangers that lay ahead. But they also knew that they could not back down. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to surrender now. "We are with you, Lord Reynard," Catherine said, her voice firm, her resolve unwavering. "We will fight alongside you, to the end." Tristan nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Elric will pay for his crimes," he said, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "We will see justice done." Reynard smiled, a grim but approving smile. "Then let us prepare for war," he said. "The lion will roar again, and this time, the whole realm will hear it." Chapter 13. The Unspoken Vow. The days at Reynard's stronghold were a whirlwind of preparations. Messengers were sent out, riders dispatched to distant lords, carrying pleas for support and warnings of Elric's growing power. The fortress itself buzzed with activity. Blacksmiths hammered out weapons, soldiers drilled in the courtyard, and strategists pored over maps, planning their campaign. Catherine and Tristan, despite their lack of formal military training, found themselves drawn into the heart of the preparations. Catherine, with her knowledge of courtly politics and her understanding of the various noble houses, proved to be a valuable advisor to Reynard. She helped him craft his messages, identifying potential allies and anticipating the reactions of the various lords. Tristan, with his experience as a knight and his knowledge of Elric's tactics, worked alongside Reynard's captains, helping to train the soldiers and develop battle strategies. He was a natural leader, his calm demeanor and quiet confidence inspiring those around him. As they worked together, Catherine and Tristan found their bond deepening. The shared dangers they had faced, the trust they had placed in each other, had forged a connection that went beyond mere alliance. They found themselves seeking each other's company, sharing quiet moments amidst the chaos, finding solace in each other's presence. One evening, as they were walking along the ramparts of the fortress, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Catherine turned to Tristan, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what will happen after?" she asked, her voice soft, the wind whipping her hair around her face. "After Elric is defeated, after justice is served?" Tristan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, hope, uncertainty, and something else, something deeper, that he couldn't quite name. "I try not to," he said, his voice low. "It is dangerous to dream too much in times like these. But yes, I have thought about it." He paused, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon. "I would like to rebuild my family's estate," he said. "To restore my father's name, to create a place of peace and prosperity." He looked back at Catherine, his eyes meeting hers. "And you, my lady?" he asked. "What are your dreams for the future?" Catherine smiled, a wistful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I would like to see Dunmere restored to its former glory," she said. "To rebuild the trust that was broken, to create a safe and prosperous land for my people. She paused, her gaze lingering on his face. But I also dream of something more, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Something I had thought was lost to me forever. Tristan stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch hers. What is it, Catherine? He asked, his voice gentle, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart beat faster. Catherine hesitated, her cheeks flushing. She had never spoken of her deepest desires, not even to Alara. But with Tristan, she felt a sense of trust, a sense of connection, that allowed her to open her heart. I dream of love, she said, her voice barely audible. Of finding someone to share my life with, someone to build a future with, someone to she couldn't finish the sentence, her voice choked with emotion. The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Tristan's hand tightened on hers. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. I understand, Catherine, he said, his voice low and husky. I dream of the same thing. He stepped even closer, his body almost touching hers. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs caressing her cheekbones. Catherine, he whispered, his voice filled with a raw emotion that made her heart soar. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers, as if seeking permission, seeking confirmation. Catherine met his gaze, her eyes filled with a love that she could no longer deny, a love that had blossomed in the midst of danger and despair, a love that had become her strength, her hope, her reason to fight. She leaned forward, her lips brushing against his. It was a tentative touch, a hesitant exploration, but it was filled with a depth of feeling that transcended words. Tristan responded, his lips pressing against hers with a growing urgency, a passion that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his body molding against hers. The kiss deepened, becoming a consuming fire, a release of all the pent-up emotions, all the fears, all the hopes that had been building between them. It was a promise, a vow, unspoken but understood. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in unison. The world around them seemed to fade away, the fortress, the preparations for war, the threat of Elric, all receding into the background. There was only the two of them, bound together by a love that had defied the odds, a love that had blossomed in the shadow of death. I love you, Catherine, Tristan whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I have loved you for a long time, I think. From the first moment in the courtyard. Catherine smiled, tears welling up in her eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had finally found its voice. And I love you, Tristan, she whispered back. With all my heart. They stood there, embraced, under the vast, starlit sky, their love a beacon of hope in a world consumed by darkness. The unspoken vow had been made, a promise of a future together, a future they would fight for, a future they would build, together. Chapter 14. Tears in the Rain. The fragile peace of their newfound love was shattered by the arrival of ill news. A rider, exhausted and mud-splattered, brought word from one of Reynard's scouts. Elric had moved faster than anticipated. He had not only consolidated his alliances, but had also launched a surprise attack on a key border town, a strategic location that controlled access to Reynard's lands. The town had fallen, its defenders overwhelmed, its people slaughtered. The news sent a wave of shock and anger through Reynard's stronghold. The war had begun in earnest, and Elric had struck the first blow, a brutal and decisive one. Reynard immediately called a council of war. The mood in the chamber was grim, the faces of the assembled lords and captains etched with concern. Elric's attack changes everything, Reynard said, his voice heavy with the weight of the news. He is clearly aiming to isolate us, to cut us off from potential allies. The discussion was heated, the debate ranging from calls for immediate retaliation to pleas for caution. Tristan, drawing on his knowledge of Elric's tactics, argued for a strategic response, a counterattack that would disrupt Elric's supply lines and force him to divert his forces. Catherine, drawing on her knowledge of the political landscape, suggested sending envoys to the remaining unaligned lords, appealing to their sense of justice and self-preservation, warning them of Elric's ultimate ambition to control the entire realm. Reynard listened carefully, weighing their arguments, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he made his decision. "We will do both," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "We will launch a counterattack, led by Tristan, to disrupt Elric's advance. And we will send envoys, led by Catherine, to rally the remaining lords to our cause." It was a risky plan, dividing their forces, but it was their best hope of stopping Elric and turning the tide of the war. The decision meant separation for Catherine and Tristan, a separation that came sooner than expected and was harder to accept. That evening, as they prepared to part, they found a few precious moments alone in Catherine's chambers. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single candle that cast flickering shadows on the walls. "I do not want to leave you," Tristan said, his voice low and filled with a raw emotion that mirrored her own. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his body a shield against the fear that gnawed at her. Catherine clung to him, her face buried in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and steel, a scent that had become synonymous with safety and comfort. "And I do not want you to go," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "But we have no choice. We must do what we must." They stood there, embraced, for a long moment, the silence filled with the unspoken weight of their fears, their hopes, their love. Tristan gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs caressing her cheekbones. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I will come back to you, Catherine," he vowed, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "I swear it. I will survive this war, and I will return to you. We will have our future together." Catherine nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, tears of fear, of love, of a desperate hope that she clung to with all her strength. "And I will be waiting for you, Tristan," she whispered. "Always." They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that was filled with the bittersweet pain of parting, the promise of reunion, the unwavering strength of their love. The next morning, as dawn broke, they parted. Tristan, clad in his armor, his sword at his hip, rode out with his contingent of soldiers, heading towards the front lines, towards the battle that awaited him. Catherine, accompanied by a small escort, set off on her own mission, riding towards the distant castles of the unaligned lords, carrying messages of hope and warnings of danger. As they rode their separate ways, a light rain began to fall, the drops cold and relentless, mirroring the tears that streamed down Catherine's face. She watched Tristan disappear into the distance, his figure becoming smaller and smaller, until he was swallowed by the mist and the rain. She felt a pang of fear, a premonition of danger, that settled like a cold stone in her heart. But she pushed it aside, clinging to the memory of his kiss, his vow, his love. She had a mission to complete, a duty to fulfill. She would not fail. She would fight for her people, for her future, for Tristan. She rode on, into the storm, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination, her love for Tristan a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. The rain continued to fall, washing away her tears, cleansing the land, but not the ache in her heart. Chapter 15. The Heart's Citadel. Catherine's journey was a grueling test of endurance and diplomacy. She traveled through treacherous landscapes, braving storms and the constant threat of ambush by Elric's patrols or bandits who preyed on the vulnerable in times of war. The lords she met were a mixed bag. Some were sympathetic to her cause but hesitant to commit, fearing Elric's power. Others were openly hostile, already seduced by Elric's promises of wealth and influence. Each rejection chipped away at her hope, each closed door a reminder of the daunting task before her. Yet, she persevered, driven by her duty to Dunmere and her unwavering belief in the justice of their cause. She used every tool at her disposal, her sharp intellect, her knowledge of courtly etiquette, her passionate pleas for unity, and, when necessary, veiled threats of the consequences of inaction. She found unexpected allies in some of the women of the noble houses. Wives, mothers, and daughters, often overlooked in the male-dominated world of medieval politics, proved to be keen observers and shrewd strategists. They saw the danger Elric posed, not just to their husbands' lands and titles, but to the entire fabric of their society. They offered Catherine advice, support, and, in some cases, secret pledges of assistance. One such woman was Lady Isolde, the wife of Lord Beaumont, a powerful but indecisive lord who had been wavering between neutrality and allegiance to Elric. Isolde, a woman of intelligence and quiet strength, saw through Elric's facade of chivalry and recognized the ruthless ambition that lay beneath. She met with Catherine in secret, in the privacy of her chambers, offering her not only words of encouragement, but also valuable information about Elric's movements and his weaknesses. "Elric is overconfident," Isolde said, her voice low and urgent. "He believes his victory is assured. He underestimates his enemies, and he neglects his defenses." She provided Catherine with details about a secret passage that led through Elric's territory, a route that could be used to bypass his main forces and strike at his heart. "Use this knowledge wisely, Lady Catherine," Isolde said. "And may the gods protect you." Catherine, grateful for Isolde's help, promised to use the information to the best of her ability. She left Beaumont's castle with renewed hope, her spirit buoyed by this unexpected alliance. As she traveled, she also received news from the front lines, carried by weary messengers and anxious refugees. The news was mixed. Tristan had achieved some initial successes, disrupting Elric's supply lines and slowing his advance. But Elric's forces were still overwhelming, and the fighting was fierce and bloody. Each report of a battle, each casualty list, sent a fresh wave of fear through Catherine. She worried constantly about Tristan, about his safety, about the possibility of never seeing him again. She clung to the memory of his kiss, his vow, his love, drawing strength from the hope of their reunion. She also received a message from Reynard, a brief but encouraging note. He had managed to secure the support of a few more lords, and his forces were growing stronger. He urged her to continue her efforts, to rally as many allies as possible. Catherine, bolstered by Reynard's message and by the growing support she was finding among the noble houses, pressed on, her determination unwavering. She knew that the fate of Dunmere, the fate of the realm, and the fate of her love with Tristan rested on her shoulders. She reached the castle of Lord Valerius, the last of the major unaligned lords. Valerius was known for his wisdom and his sense of justice, a man who valued peace and stability above all else. He was their last, best hope of securing a decisive alliance. She was granted an audience with Valerius in his great hall, a magnificent chamber filled with tapestries and banners, symbols of his long and distinguished lineage. Valerius, an elderly man with a kind face and piercing blue eyes, listened patiently as Catherine presented her case, outlining Elric's crimes, his ambition, and the danger he posed to the entire realm. When she had finished, Valerius remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, his expression thoughtful. "You speak eloquently, Lady Catherine," he said finally, his voice slow and deliberate. "And your arguments are compelling. But I am an old man, and I have seen many wars. I know the cost of conflict, the price of loyalty." He paused, his gaze shifting to the window, where the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. "I have also heard rumors," he said, his voice low, "of a great battle fought near the border. A battle in which Sir Tristan de Clare, your champion, was reportedly killed." Catherine's heart stopped. The blood drained from her face. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a cold dread that threatened to consume her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible.
"It cannot be. It is a lie."
Valerius looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "I hope, for your sake, that it is," he said. "But the rumors are persistent, and they come from multiple sources." Catherine felt her world crumbling around her. Tristan dead? It was impossible. She refused to believe it. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly, feeding on her fears, her vulnerabilities. The heart's citadel, her love, was under siege. Chapter 16. Beyond the Walls. The news of Tristan's supposed death struck Catherine like a physical blow. The world around her seemed to tilt, the colors fading, the sounds of the bustling hall receding into a distant hum. She swayed, her knees threatening to buckle, but she forced herself to remain standing, her pride and her desperation holding her upright. I do not believe it, she said, her voice trembling, but firm. Tristan is alive. He must be. Lord Valerius, his expression filled with a mixture of pity and respect, gestured for her to sit. Catherine reluctantly obeyed, her body feeling heavy and numb. I understand your disbelief, Lady Catherine, Valerius said gently. But the rumors are strong, and they come from sources that are usually reliable. Alaric himself has proclaimed Tristan's death, boasting of his victory. Catherine closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She pictured Tristan, his face, his smile, his eyes filled with that unwavering light. She could not imagine a world without him, a world without his strength, his courage, his love. I must know the truth, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I must go to the battlefield. I must see for myself. Valerius shook his head. That would be madness, Lady Catherine. The area is swarming with Alaric soldiers. You would be captured, or worse. I do not care, Catherine said, her voice rising, her despair giving way to a fierce determination. I will not sit here, waiting for news, wondering if the man I love is alive or dead. I must go. Valerius studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing her resolve, her desperation. He saw a strength in her, a fire that burned bright despite the darkness that surrounded her. Very well, he said finally, his voice resigned. I will not stop you. But I will not allow you to go alone. I will provide you with an escort, a small group of my most trusted men. They will help you reach the battlefield, and they will protect you as best they can. Catherine felt a surge of gratitude, a flicker of hope amidst the despair. Thank you, Lord Valerius, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Thank you. Valerius' men were seasoned warriors, skilled in stealth and survival. They knew the terrain, and they were familiar with Alaric's tactics. They were led by a grizzled veteran named Gareth, a coincidence that did little to settle Catherine's stomach, a man of few words but unwavering loyalty. They set off under the cover of darkness, riding through the night, avoiding the main roads, sticking to hidden paths and trails. The journey was perilous, the constant threat of discovery hanging over them. As they rode, Catherine's mind raced. She prayed for Tristan's safety, prayed that the rumors were false, that he was still alive. She clung to the hope, however faint, that she would find him, that she would see him again. They reached the outskirts of the battlefield as dawn was breaking. The scene that greeted them was one of devastation. The ground was scarred and blackened, littered with the debris of war-broken weapons, shattered shields, the bodies of men and horses. The air was thick with the stench of death, a grim reminder of the brutal cost of conflict. Catherine's heart ached at the sight. She scanned the battlefield, her eyes searching for any sign of Tristan, any sign of hope. Gareth, his face grim, approached her. My lady, he said, his voice low, we must be careful. There are still Alaric soldiers in the area, scavenging for loot and searching for survivors. They moved cautiously through the battlefield, their senses alert to any sign of danger. They came across a group of wounded soldiers, some from Reynard's army, others from Alaric's. Catherine, despite her own fears, stopped to help them, offering them water, tending to their wounds, offering words of comfort. She asked them about Tristan, about the battle, about his fate. But the answers were conflicting and uncertain. Some said they had seen him fall, struck down by a mortal blow. Others claimed he had fought like a lion, cutting down dozens of enemies before being overwhelmed. Still others said he had simply disappeared, vanished in the chaos of the battle. Catherine's hope dwindled with each passing hour. The evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting. Tristan was gone. As they were searching, they came across a small, makeshift graveyard where some of the fallen soldiers had been buried. Catherine walked among the graves, her heart heavy with grief, reading the names on the crude wooden crosses.
Suddenly, she stopped.
Her eyes fixed on a particular grave, a newly dug mound of earth with a simple wooden cross at its head. On the cross, carved in rough letters, was a single word, Tristan. Catherine stared at the grave, her mind numb with disbelief, with a grief so profound that it threatened to consume her. This could not be. It was a mistake, a cruel joke. She fell to her knees, her hands reaching out to touch the cold earth, as if she could somehow reach through the barrier of death and touch him, hold him, bring him back. No, she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. No, no. No, the tears flowed freely now, unstoppable, a torrent of grief and despair. She wept for Tristan, for their love, for the future they had dreamed of, a future that had been stolen from them. She was beyond the fortress walls of composure now. Gareth and his men stood silently nearby, their heads bowed, their hearts heavy with sorrow. They knew that they could offer no comfort, that Catherine's grief was a private burden, a pain that only she could bear. As she knelt there, weeping, a faint sound reached her ears. A soft moan coming from nearby. Catherine lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, searching for the source of the sound. There, lying amongst the debris of the battle, hidden beneath a shattered wagon, was a figure. A man, clad in battered armor, his face covered in blood and dirt. Catherine scrambled to her feet, her legs shaky, her heart filled with a desperate hope. She rushed towards the figure, her hands reaching out to him. It was Tristan. He was alive. Chapter 17. A glimmer of dawn. The sight of Tristan, alive but grievously wounded, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Catherine, momentarily overriding her grief and exhaustion. He lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged, his face pale and streaked with blood. A deep gash ran across his chest, partially obscured by the torn remnants of his surcoat, and his left arm lay at an unnatural angle. Tristan! Catherine cried, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his injuries, afraid to touch him, afraid to cause him more pain. Gareth and his men rushed to her side, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and concern. Gareth, a veteran of countless battles, immediately assessed Tristan's condition. "He's alive, my lady," Gareth said, his voice gruff but reassuring, but barely. "He's lost a lot of blood, and his arm is broken. We need to get him to safety, and quickly." They carefully lifted Tristan, supporting his head and his injured arm, and carried him to a more sheltered location, a small copse of trees that had somehow escaped the destruction of the battle. Catherine, walking beside them, never took her eyes off Tristan, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. They laid him down gently on a bed of leaves, and Catherine immediately began to tend to his wounds. She tore strips of cloth from her own clothing, using them to staunch the bleeding from his chest wound. She cleaned his face with water from her flask, wiping away the blood and dirt, revealing the familiar features that she had feared she would never see again. As she worked, she whispered to him, her voice choked with emotion, telling him that she was there, that he was safe, that she loved him. She did not know if he could hear her, but she needed to speak the words, to reaffirm the bond that had been so nearly severed. Gareth, meanwhile, had fashioned a makeshift splint for Tristan's broken arm, using branches and strips of cloth. He worked with a practiced efficiency, his movements precise and deliberate. They worked together, Catherine and Gareth, their efforts driven by a desperate hope, a fierce determination to save Tristan's life. The other soldiers stood guard, their eyes scanning the surrounding area, alert for any sign of danger. After what seemed like an eternity, they had done all they could. Tristan's bleeding had been staunched, his arm was splinted, and he was wrapped in a blanket to keep him warm. He remained unconscious, his breathing still shallow, but his pulse was stronger, more stable. Catherine sat beside him, holding his hand, her gaze fixed on his face. She watched for any sign of change, any flicker of consciousness, any indication that he was fighting to survive. The hours passed slowly, the sun rising higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Catherine refused to leave Tristan's side, even for a moment. She spoke to him softly, telling him stories of their time together, reminding him of their love, of their dreams for the future. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, Tristan stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and a low moan escaped his lips. "Tristan?" Catherine whispered, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "Tristan, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, his gaze unfocused at first, then gradually clearing. He looked at Catherine, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and pain. "Catherine?" he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "What happened?" Catherine smiled, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You are injured," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But you're safe now. We are here. We are together." Tristan tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his chest, forcing him to lie back down. "Easy," Catherine said, gently restraining him. "You must rest. You are weak." Tristan's gaze drifted to Gareth and the other soldiers, then back to Catherine. He seemed to be slowly piecing together what had happened, his memory returning in fragments. "The battle," he whispered. "I remember falling. It is over," Catherine said.
"We found you."
"You're safe." Tristan closed his eyes for a moment, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. Then he opened them again, his gaze fixed on Catherine. I thought I had lost you," he whispered. Catherine squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude.
"And I thought I had lost you," she said.
"But we are here. We are together. And that is all that matters." They remained there, in the quiet solitude of the copse, as the day drew to a close. Catherine continued to tend to Tristan's wounds, offering him water, keeping him warm. As darkness fell, Gareth approached them. "My lady," he said, his voice low, "we must move. It is not safe to remain here. Our soldiers will be searching for survivors, and they will show no mercy." Catherine knew that he was right. They had to leave, to find a safer place to shelter and allow Tristan to recover. But she was reluctant to move him, fearing that it would worsen his condition. "Where can we go?"
she asked.
"Where will we be safe?" Gareth pointed towards the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist. "There are hidden villages in those mountains," he said. "Places where Elric's reach does not extend. We can find refuge there, and Tristan can heal." It was a risky journey, a long and arduous trek through treacherous terrain. But it was their only hope. They carefully lifted Tristan onto a makeshift litter, fashioned from branches and blankets. They set off into the darkness, their steps slow and deliberate, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The glimmer of dawn, which had seemed so distant, now felt like a tangible promise, a hope that they would reach safety, that Tristan would recover, that their love would endure. Chapter 18. The Sword's Edge. The journey to the mountain villages was a harrowing ordeal. Tristan, weakened by his injuries and drifting in and out of consciousness, endured the bumpy ride on the makeshift litter with a stoicism that both inspired and terrified Catherine. Every jolt, every stumble, sent a fresh wave of fear through her, fearing that it would worsen his condition. Gareth and his men, their strength and loyalty unwavering, took turns carrying the litter, navigating the treacherous terrain with a skill born of years of experience. They moved slowly, cautiously, avoiding any sign of Elric's patrols, sticking to hidden paths and trails. Catherine walked beside Tristan, constantly monitoring his condition, offering him sips of water, adjusting his blankets, whispering words of encouragement and love. She refused to leave his side, even for a moment, her presence a constant reassurance, a beacon of hope in the darkness. They faced numerous challenges along the way. They had to cross raging rivers, climb steep cliffs, and navigate dense forests. The weather was unforgiving, with periods of torrential rain and biting winds. Food was scarce, and they were forced to rely on their hunting and foraging skills to survive. Despite the hardships, they pressed on, driven by their determination to reach safety, to save Tristan's life. They found strength in each other, in their shared purpose, in their unwavering belief in a future together. After several days of arduous travel, they finally reached the foothills of the mountains. They came across a small, isolated village, nestled in a hidden valley, its inhabitants wary but welcoming. The villagers, simple farmers and shepherds, were initially suspicious of the strangers, but Gareth, speaking in their dialect, explained their situation, appealing to their sense of compassion and humanity. The villagers, moved by their plight, offered them shelter and assistance. They provided them with food, warm clothing, and a place to rest. They also had a healer, an elderly woman named Alara, another coincidence that, this time, brought comfort, who was skilled in the use of herbs and traditional remedies. Alara examined Tristan carefully, her wrinkled hands gently probing his wounds. She cleaned and dressed his chest wound, applying a poultice of healing herbs. She also reset his broken arm, using a splint made of wood and bark. "He is strong," Alara said, her voice raspy but reassuring. "He will survive. But he needs rest, and he needs time to heal." Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. Alara's words, though simple, were a balm to her soul. She had been carrying the weight of Tristan's survival on her shoulders, and now, finally, she could share that burden. She could allow herself to hope. They settled into the village, finding a small, empty hut to use as their shelter. Catherine stayed by Tristan's side, tending to his needs, watching over him as he slept. She spoke to him softly, telling him stories of Dunmere, of their plans for the future, of their love. Tristan slowly began to recover. His fever subsided, his breathing became stronger, and he regained consciousness for longer periods of time. He was still weak, but he was alive and he was healing. As he recovered, he and Catherine spoke of the events that had transpired, of the battle, of his near-death experience, of her desperate search for him. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. "I thought I had lost you," Tristan said, his voice still weak, but filled with emotion. "I saw the sword coming down, and I thought it was the end." Catherine squeezed his hand, her heart aching at the thought of what he had endured. "And I thought I had lost you," she said. "When I saw that grave, I thought my world had ended." They held each other close, their love a tangible presence in the small, humble hut. They had faced death, and they had survived. Their bond was stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of war and loss. News arrived, eventually. Reynard had pushed back. One evening, as they were sitting outside the hut, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a messenger arrived from Reynard. The messenger, a young, weary-looking soldier, brought news of the war. Reynard, bolstered by the support of several newly allied lords, had launched a counteroffensive against Elric. The fighting was still fierce, but the tide was turning. Elric's forces were retreating, and his alliances were beginning to crumble. The messenger also brought a personal message for Catherine, a letter from Reynard himself. Reynard wrote of his relief at hearing of Tristan's survival, of his admiration for Catherine's courage and determination, and of his confidence in their ultimate victory. He urged them to remain in hiding until it was safe to return, promising to send an escort as soon as the situation allowed. The news filled Catherine and Tristan with renewed hope. The war was not over, but victory was within reach. They could begin to dream of a future where they could finally be together, a future where they could rebuild their lives, their homes, their love. But the sword's edge, the threat, was very real. Chapter 19. Truth's Unveiling. The weeks that followed were a period of slow, steady recovery for Tristan. The clean mountain air, the nourishing food provided by the villagers, and Alara's skillful care worked wonders. His strength returned, his wounds healed, and the light returned to his eyes. He spent his days resting, regaining his strength, and spending time with Catherine. They explored the village and its surroundings, taking short walks in the nearby meadows and forests, their hands clasped together, their conversations filled with laughter and shared dreams. They spoke of Dunmere, of rebuilding their lives, of a future free from the shadow of Elric. As Tristan's physical strength returned, so too did his desire to rejoin the fight. He chafed at his inactivity, eager to return to Reynard's side and help secure the victory that was now within reach. Catherine, while understanding his desire, was torn. She wanted to see Alric defeated, to see justice served, but she also feared for Tristan's safety. She had come so close to losing him once, and the thought of him facing danger again filled her with dread. They discussed it often, their conversations filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Tristan argued that he had a duty to his men, to Reynard, to the cause of justice. Catherine argued that he had a duty to himself, to his recovery, to their future together. Finally, they reached a compromise. Tristan would wait until he was fully healed, until Alara gave her approval, before considering a return to the battlefield. And Catherine would accept his decision, trusting in his judgment and his strength. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire in their hut, a stranger arrived in the village. He was a tall, thin man, dressed in the simple garb of a traveler, his face weathered and lined. He carried no weapons, but there was an air of authority about him, a sense of quiet confidence that set him apart. The villagers, wary of strangers, directed him to Catherine and Tristan, knowing that they were outsiders, connected to the larger world beyond the mountains. The stranger approached them, his gaze fixed on Tristan. He bowed slightly, his movements graceful and precise. "Sir Tristan de Clare," he said, his voice low and cultured.
"I have been searching for you."
Tristan, surprised by the stranger's knowledge of his name, rose to his feet, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword, which he now wore again, a symbol of his returning strength.
"Who are you?"
Tristan asked, his voice cautious. "And why are you looking for me?" The stranger smiled, a knowing smile that did not quite reach his eyes.
"My name is unimportant," he said.
"But my purpose is clear. I have come to reveal a truth that has been hidden for too long." He paused, his gaze shifting to Catherine, then back to Tristan. "I am the one who sent the message to Lord Reynard," he said. "The message that warned him of Arian's treachery and your desperate flight." Catherine and Tristan exchanged a look of surprise. This was the mysterious benefactor who had saved their lives, the unknown ally who had been watching over them.
"But why?"
Catherine asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Why did you help us?" The stranger's smile faded, replaced by a look of sadness and regret. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I was once a part of the conspiracy. I was one of the men who plotted to overthrow Baron Alaric and place Alaric on the throne." Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tristan's grip tightened on his sword, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and anger. You were one of them?" Tristan said, his voice low and dangerous. The stranger nodded, his head bowed in shame. "Yes," he said. "I was a young, ambitious knight, seduced by Alric's promises of power and wealth. I believed in his cause. I believed that he would bring prosperity and stability to the realm." He paused, his voice choked with emotion. "But I was wrong. I was blinded by my ambition, deafened by Alric's lies. I did not see the truth, the darkness that lay at the heart of his plan." He looked up, his eyes meeting Tristan's. "It was I," he said, "who forged the letters that implicated your father, Sir Gareth. I was skilled in the art of imitation, and Alric used my skills to create the false evidence that led to your father's execution." Tristan stared at him, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, disbelief, and a flicker of understanding. "Why are you telling us this now?" Tristan asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Because," the stranger said, "I have seen the error of my ways. I have witnessed Alric's cruelty, his ruthlessness, his utter disregard for human life. I have seen the suffering he has caused, and I can no longer remain silent." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "This," he said, "is my confession. It contains all the details of the conspiracy, the names of those involved, the evidence of Alric's crimes. I have kept it hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it." He held out the book to Tristan. "Take it," he said. "Use it to expose Alric, to bring him to justice. It is the least I can do to atone for my sins." Tristan hesitated for a moment, then took the book, his fingers closing around it tightly. He looked at the stranger, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a grudging respect.
"What will you do now?"
Tristan asked. The stranger shrugged.
"I do not know," he said.
"I have lived with this guilt for too long. I am prepared to face the consequences of my actions." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Catherine and Tristan. "I wish you both well," he said. "May you find the peace and happiness that I have lost." He disappeared into the night, leaving Catherine and Tristan alone with the book, with the truth that had finally been unveiled. The weight of the revelation, the burden of the past, and the hope for the future, all mingled together, a complex tapestry of emotions that would shape their lives forever. Truth had been brought to light. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The Stranger's Confession, a meticulously detailed account of Elric's conspiracy, provided the final, irrefutable piece of evidence they needed. It confirmed what they had already suspected, but it also revealed the full extent of Elric's treachery and the involvement of others, some of whom were still in positions of power. Tristan, now fully recovered, was determined to return to Reynard and present the confession, to finally expose Elric and bring him to justice. Catherine, though still apprehensive about his safety, knew that he was right. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. They said farewell to the villagers, thanking them for their kindness and hospitality. Alara, the healer, gave Tristan a final blessing, assuring him that he was strong enough to travel. They set off, accompanied by Gareth and his men, who had remained steadfastly loyal throughout their ordeal. The journey back to Reynard's stronghold was less arduous than their previous trek, the knowledge that victory was within reach spurring them on. They arrived at Reynard's fortress to find it buzzing with activity. The news of Elric's defeats had spread, and more lords had joined Reynard's cause. The balance of power had shifted, and the momentum was now clearly on their side. Reynard greeted them with warmth and relief, his face lighting up at the sight of Tristan, fully recovered and ready to fight. He listened intently as Tristan presented the stranger's confession, his eyes widening with each revelation. "This changes everything," Reynard said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "With this evidence, we can expose Elric before the king and the entire realm. His support will crumble, and his reign of terror will end." A council of war was called, and Tristan presented the confession to the assembled lords. The reaction was one of outrage and disbelief, followed by a renewed determination to bring Elric to justice. Plans were made for a final confrontation. Reynard's army, now bolstered by the newly allied forces, would march on Elric's stronghold, a fortified city that had been his base of operations. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody, but the outcome was never in doubt. Reynard's forces, inspired by the knowledge of Elric's treachery and fueled by a desire for revenge, fought with a courage and determination that overwhelmed Elric's demoralized troops. Tristan, fighting at Reynard's side, distinguished himself in the battle, his skill with the sword and his tactical acumen proving invaluable. He fought with a righteous fury, his every blow fueled by the memory of his father, by the injustice he had suffered, by the love he shared with Catherine. Catherine, though not on the battlefield, played a crucial role in the victory. She remained at Reynard's fortress, coordinating the logistics of the campaign, managing the flow of supplies and reinforcements, and using her diplomatic skills to maintain the unity of the alliance. The siege of Elric's city lasted for several days, but finally, the walls were breached and Reynard's forces stormed into the city. Elric was captured, his power broken, his reign of terror at an end. He was brought before the assembled lords, his hands bound, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and defiance. Tristan, standing beside Reynard, presented the stranger's confession, reading aloud the details of Elric's crimes, the evidence of his treachery. Elric, faced with the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, finally broke down. He confessed to his crimes, begging for mercy, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Justice was swift and decisive. Elric was stripped of his titles and lands and sentenced to death. The lords who had supported him were also punished, their fates ranging from imprisonment to exile. With Elric defeated and justice served, the realm began to heal. The wounds of war would take time to mend, but the shadow of tyranny had been lifted, and a new era of peace and prosperity had begun. Tristan and Catherine, their duty fulfilled, their love tested and proven, returned to Dunmere. They were greeted as heroes, their arrival celebrated with feasts and festivities. They set about rebuilding Dunmere, restoring it to its former glory. They implemented reforms, ensuring justice and fairness for all their people. They honored the memory of those who had died, and they rewarded those who had remained loyal. And, finally, they were married. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall of Dunmere, the same hall where they had first met as children, the same hall where Tristan had been accused of treachery, the same hall where their love had blossomed amidst the darkness of war. The hall was filled with guests, lords and ladies from across the realm, villagers and soldiers, all those who had played a part in their journey. Reynard was there, his presence a symbol of the alliance that had brought them victory. Alara, from the mountain village, was also there, her presence a reminder of the kindness and compassion they had found in the most unexpected of places. Catherine, radiant in a gown of white silk, walked down the aisle on the arm of Lord Baldwin, her father's trusted advisor, who had been like a second father to her. Tristan, standing at the altar, his eyes filled with love and admiration, watched her approach, his heart overflowing with joy. They exchanged their vows, their voices clear and strong, their love a beacon of hope for the future. They were united, not only in marriage, but in purpose, in their commitment to building a better world, a world free from tyranny and injustice. The reckoning of love and duty had been made. They had faced the challenges, overcome the obstacles, and emerged victorious. Their love had endured, their duty had been fulfilled, and their future, together, stretched before them, bright and full of promise. Epilogue. Years passed, and Dunmere flourished under the wise and just rule of Lady Catherine and Sir Tristan. The scars of war slowly faded, replaced by a sense of peace and prosperity that had not been known in the land for generations. The fields yielded bountiful harvests, the markets thrived, and the people lived without fear, their loyalty to their rulers unwavering. Catherine and Tristan rebuilt not only Dunmere's physical structures, the castle, the walls, the homes of their people, but also the trust that had been shattered by Elric's treachery. They established a council of advisors, drawn from all levels of society, ensuring that the voices of the common folk were heard alongside those of the nobility. They reformed the laws, making them fairer and more equitable, and they established a system of justice that was both swift and merciful. Their love, forged in the crucible of war and loss, deepened with each passing year. They found joy in each other's company, in the simple pleasures of life, a shared meal, a walk in the gardens, a quiet evening by the fire. They supported each other through challenges and celebrated each other's triumphs, their bond unbreakable, their love a constant source of strength and inspiration. Children came, filling Dunmere's halls with laughter and the promise of a new generation. A son, Alaric, named after Catherine's father, inherited his grandfather's sense of justice and his mother's intelligence. A daughter, Lyra, inherited her father's courage and her mother's compassion. They grew up surrounded by love and security, taught the values of honor, loyalty, and service. Tristan, though he never forgot his past, found peace in his new life. He rebuilt his family's estate, restoring it to its former glory, and he established a training school for knights, where he taught young men not only the skills of warfare but also the importance of chivalry, of honor, of protecting the weak and serving the greater good. He never sought power or glory for himself, content to serve his wife, his family, and his people. Catherine, though she carried the weight of responsibility with grace and determination, never lost her compassion or her empathy. She remained close to Alara, her lady-in-waiting, who had been her confidant and friend through all the trials they had faced. She also maintained contact with Lady Isolde, the woman who had secretly aided her during her mission to rally the lords, their friendship a testament to the power of female solidarity in a male-dominated world. One autumn evening, many years after the war, Catherine and Tristan stood together on the battlements of Dunmere, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a familiar and comforting aroma. Catherine, her hair now streaked with silver, leaned against Tristan, her body still fitting perfectly against his, even after all these years. Tristan, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes still filled with that unwavering light, wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Do you remember," Catherine said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, "when we first met, as children, in this very castle?" Tristan smiled, a nostalgic smile that softened the hard lines of his face.
"I remember," he said.
"You were a spirited young girl, full of mischief and laughter. And I was a shy, awkward boy, completely smitten." Catherine chuckled. "And you accused me of cheating at dice," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Tristan laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the evening air. "And you threw a goblet of wine at me," he said. They stood there, reminiscing, their memories weaving a tapestry of shared experiences, of love and loss, of hardship and triumph. "We have come a long way," Catherine said, her voice filled with a quiet contentment. Tristan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the valley below, over the fields and forests that made up their domain, over the castle that was their home.
"We have," he said.
"And we have done it together." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze filled with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. "I love you, Catherine," he said, his voice simple but profound. Catherine smiled, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "And I love you, Tristan," she said. "Always." They stood there, embraced, under the vast, starlit sky, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a story whispered on the wind, a legend etched in the stones of Dunmere. The shadow of the past had receded, replaced by the bright promise of the future, a future they had built together, a future they would share, always.